Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many of your faces. I think we're getting close to 200 online here. I'm Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, the president at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and I'm so honored to moderate this panel today in the middle of summer. I know that no one does not have on their mind, even in the midst of traveling and time away and rest, the state of our nation and our world, and hence today our conversation, spirituality in a time of unrest. It's hard to figure out what word to use for that phrase, unrest. We are living in a moment of immense political upheaval, for many people on this call, spiritual exhaustion, and social, cultural, economic, global unrest. And it's particularly at a moment like this that it's important that we ask the question that Union is always asking of our students, our faculty, our leadership as an institution, and all of our speakers today are committed to asking, and that is, what is the role that faith, spirituality, and conscience play at this moment? What does ethical leadership look like in response to the moment we find ourselves in? And today we hope to have time also to talk about how do we care for ourselves and our communities so that we don't give in to despair or a sense of utter burnout. Today, we are joined by 5 extraordinary leaders. I can't believe we're so grateful to have all of them gather today to be a part of this conversation. Each of them is deeply rooted in their own tradition and practice, and each of them has shown throughout their lives and their work their deep commitment to the hard, sacred labor of public and spiritual leadership, those two together. So I'd like to start out by introducing our panelists. We have the Reverend Greg Snyder, who is Senior Director and Assistant Professor of Buddhist Studies at Union. We have Maggie Siddiqi, who is Senior Fellow at the Interfaith Alliance. We have Dr. Simran Jeet Singh, who is Assistant Professor of Interreligious Histories at Union and Senior Advisor for the Aspen Institute's Religion and Society program. We have Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who is Senior Rabbi Emerita of Congregation Bet Shemot Torah, also known as CBST. And we have the Reverend Fred Davie, who is Senior Executive Vice President for Public Theology and Civic Engagement here at Union Theological Seminary. And myself, Serene Jones, is going to be moderating the conversation today. We're going to go for about an hour with our panelists and then open it up to people who are participating to ask questions and to join in the conversation. So there's so much ground to cover, and we have a short period of time today, but I want to open up with a general question that there is no short answer to, but if we could just get some words on the table, and that is, how are each of you, out of your own religious and spiritual traditions, finding language to talk about the moral and spiritual nature of the crisis that we find ourselves in right now, in our nation and around the world? And Greg, you're first on the panelist list, so I thought I would just start with you, and we'll move through the panelists and get some language on the table that we can begin to talk through and sort through.
Thank you, Serene, and thank you for having me here, and thank you to everyone who's attending today. From my own tradition, the first thing that jumps out, there's so many ways to come at this question, but the thing that jumps out to me right now is that I feel part of the issue is that we have become very comfortable as a nation dehumanizing each other. for many, many reasons, whether it be to protect the centralization of power from people who for a certain group of people, and a large number of people are being dehumanized and violently treated for those reasons, both through policy and action, but also even those who are resisting that, the ways that um, it is easy to write people off or put them aside. And there's something in the undercurrent of that, and from this is not just for Buddhism, but just the very notion that separation or attachment to self is going to be the cause of the majority of the suffering, and the way we identify and can put people outside of that and attack them in certain ways. There's just no pathway from that to an inclusive democratic political structure and democratic economic structure. So there's something that needs to be addressed in that spiritually, both within ourselves and in the political and social discourse. So that's one. I think dehumanization for me is it's become too casual and too easy to do that. So that's something that strikes me as has to be addressed spiritually. Thank you.
Maggie, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. And thank you for having me as part of this conversation. I'm really thinking along similar lines, I think, to Greg, because I see one of the biggest challenges of this time of unrest, as you called it, as one of division, right? Authoritarian regimes throughout history have engaged in divide and conquer tactics, right, in order to prevent a coalition from forming that could be powerful enough to confront it. They deploy the strategy to hold on power. They spin a narrative that downplays the the humanity, right? The strong alignment that diverse groups in our midst have on a multitude of values and issues, and then they amplify the smaller subset of issues around which there is passionate disagreement. And I think from a political standpoint, they do this because they know too well that a diverse, right, multiracial, interfaith coalition would be politically unstoppable. And I think the work of coming together, of bridge building, of coalition building in this moment is a politically essential exercise and a spiritually essential one as well, right? I believe we can continue to disagree with one another while recognizing there are many ways that we can work together. And the spiritual impacts, right, of giving into that division are the sense of isolation, the sense of, well, if no one is going to stand up for me, then I guess I need to stand up only for myself. I heard one pastor refer to it as conflicting visions for freedom, right? Like this sort of don't tread on me version of freedom that's kind of prevalent these days versus the kind of freedom which is about ensuring my neighbors and I all have what we need. And the latter, of course, is far more in line with our moral and faithful ideals. And so I think there's this opportunity in this moment, right, to remind people through our various traditions of the possibilities for the world that feel hard to imagine in these times of difficulty and I'd say intentional division, right? To articulate what unity looks like, what solidarity looks like across difference. When we're made to think our problems are unsolvable, our differences are intractable, what might a united community look like, right? That fosters collaboration and community with our neighbors. And that takes a little bit of I think, moral and spiritual imagination as part of that kind of political process.
Thank you. And we're going to come back to that in terms of how we vision where we need to be going and how we get there. But wanted to see Simran, Sharon, Fred, maybe Simran, if you want to add to this opening question in terms of an analysis of our context.
Yeah, well, just to touch on top of what Greg and Maggie have shared, and it's not what I was reflecting on coming in, but listening to them, I'm struck by the nature of fear in all of this, the way that the divisions rely on a sense of a scarcity mindset as opposed to abundance, which is what our traditions teach us, and that results in a commitment to tribalism, that I am going to shrink back into my own communities and my own needs. And it really limits the possibility of imagining more expansively our relationships beyond the tribes. And so as we're seeing across our globe and within our country, this fear mongering result in the shrinking back, I think the question for us becomes, as people of faith, what do our traditions have to teach us about how we combat fear, and how we allow or don't allow fear to enter into the equation? We might say there's no place for fear in perfect love. And in my tradition, one of the things we say is, there's this line in our scripture where we say, "Ek nahi chakri jitwo khasam na jaye." What kind of service is it when it's inspired by fear? That's not service. Service is when it's coming out of love. And so is there a way that we can reclaim our commitment to love and service in a way that is inspired by abundance, that is inspired by connection rather than the scarcity and tribalism that's taken hold of us?
Now, Sharon, you want to jump in here?
Thank you. And I have to say, I get so much strength just from looking around the screen. How fantastic is it? And I think that's part of what God and religion have to teach us, which is showing up together. And we don't have to have all the answers. We have to understand the pathway to those answers. And the first thing that we know is how profound it is to stand together with others, to say we resist, and we are trying to figure out the best way to bring God's presence more visible to the earth, despite the language and rhetoric and violence and hate. So for me at this moment, I feel that religion for me and my life as a person of faith teaches me from two different roots as a Jew. One is history and the other is theology. I can look to history to understand the long history that exists of authoritarian dictators who commit heinous crimes and their patterns of division and of violence. And I could also look at history and see the long history of people of compassion and of commitment coming together to create an alternative and to, in the midst of that hatred and violence, find ways to resist, both in political and visible ways and in deeply emotional, spiritual ways that ensure there is a future. All of us are here today because there have been that tensions in past history and people who have stood up despite horrors and hate and violence and death and destruction and evil. And they've made it possible for us to be here. And I think likewise, our job is to figure out how to make it possible for future generations to look back on this time of hate, but also see this is a time of great coming together, a time of great love, a time of great conversation, unity. Even if we don't necessarily agree, we're creating a model of what a world could look like. And second is theological, that I believe deeply, no matter what the world around me, how sharp and painfully it burns, my tradition teaches me, bimkom she'eno anashim, in a place where there is no humanity, that's exactly when God demands of us to be the most human. That's exactly the moment we have to not just descend into the, well, everybody else is doing it, or what does it matter, or okay, how could I possibly make a difference? That's exactly the moment that we're called upon to reach deep and to find the most human part of us and all across all traditions and respond in a way that reflects that and not just reflects, mirrors back the evil, but we have to go deep inside. And that's what, for me, religion helps us do, to not accept the empirical, the desert that we find ourselves in. The Israelites were in a harsh desert situation for many, many years, but what they had was leadership that provided vision of what a promised land could look like. That the desolation, destruction, starvation of the desert is not the only reality. There is a reality that God calls us on to make real every day. And that takes vision, it takes faith, it takes joy, it takes not giving into the despair that's so crushing. So that's, for me, in a brief nutshell, what gives me the perspective of the moment we're in now.
Well, thank you. And Fred?
Thank you,
Sorry.
Serene, and thank you. And let me do a quick thank you to our team at Union, also who helped make this possible. All those folks who helped organize today. Two people in particular, I will just do a shout out to two of Union's student interns, Giselle Rondon and Emma Foster. Giselle actually just graduated, but has stayed with our Center for Community Engagement and Social Justice to help make events like this happen. So let me thank them. And let me thank all the people who've gathered here today as well. We appreciate your being a part of this and your commitment to this work and this effort to make the world the kind of place we want it to be. Now, to the question, I would say that I would highlight as sort of a huge moral, ethical challenge for us and our faith traditions is the capitulation and the acquiescence of institutions that the country depends on and the world depends on in order to have the kind of order, democracy, ways of relating that we so want and we so depend on. And so when we look at universities, law firms, even our own Congress, I think, Greg, you used the word normalizing a form of behavior that allows authoritarian tendencies, if not actual activities, to run unchecked. Then I think our theological institutions have to dig deep. We have to dig deep in our theological traditions and say this runs counter to what it means to live in community, and that these institutions have a responsibility to the people that they represent, not to give in to the most base of our instincts and tendencies, but to be the institutions that they were or have been established to be, particularly our Congress, particularly our universities. And law firms and corporations that depend so much on public support for what they do. We have a long tradition of people from Dr. King in the 60s calling on our institutions to be responsive to Black churches and other faith institutions, standing up to these institutions to try to make them be the entities that they're supposed to be. So I would say that that our obligation, among many, is to plumb the depths of what's the best of our traditions, and then to really speak truth to these powerful institutions that have decided that they're going to play along with this game of authoritarianism, as opposed to challenging it, in the ways that they have an obligation to. Again, particularly our universities, our Congress, and even our corporations and businesses, especially law firms.
And I might add to that, even our religious communities.
Even our religious communities, yes.
Yes. So I just thank you all. That was very comprehensive and dead on. And I want to ask a question and then move into some very practical conversation. But I myself find it easier to diagnose what is wrong because it's so evident, so in your face every day, than it is at a moment when things are crumbling to find within myself a vibrant and strong alternative vision to what's happening. And not a sort of vague vision, but we know that the majority of people in the United States are not content with what's happening, and yet there seems to be a lack of will to engage, to push back, to step into that space. So, how do we generate a conversation about the vision of the future we want that compels people forward? Like, how do we reach into our truth? If we can't do that as religious leaders, who's going to do that? So maybe we'll start, Maggie, with you this time. If you want, then you can pass it on to someone else if you want.
I'm really excited to see what other people answer to this. No, I think this is the tricky part that you just named, right? Is sort of spurring us into action, right? Because in some ways there is I talked about sort of the challenge to our values around divisiveness, but I think there's also a gaslighting about what our values are, right? Like you just named the majority of people in this country that sort of align with, right? Believe immigration is a good thing and support closing loopholes for background checks and for purchasing a firearm and all of these things where we know the majority stand with those policies and then yet elected officials vote the opposite way, right? Against the interests of the people who've elected them. And so, right, that is sort of the challenge of the moment is not just to, remind our communities about our values, but also to help our communities connect that with calling folks into account about the betrayal of those values, right? And the exerting of undue influence and decisions from the interests of the wealthy. And right, this is not a space of comfort for a lot of us because it requires us to figure out how to avoid miring our faith communities in partisan politics while also helping them proclaim those faith values in the public squares in ways that we may not have done before. But I think there is so much to draw from our religions in putting this into practice. One of the things that came to mind as I was thinking about this webinar was the challenges to building a big tent multi-faith coalition, right? Means that you're in coalition with people that you disagree with, right? And that's one of the obstacles, I think, to being able to take action. And the lesson that I think I take from Islam in this is we have this communal obligation around ritual worship, right? So we have a communal obligation, for example, to engage in Friday prayers. We go to whatever's closest to us. We just go there because there are other Muslims there. We don't necessarily go there because that's where the best sermon is. We don't necessarily know who those other people are. And we may know them and not like them, but we still show up anyway. Because there's this sense of when it's time to pray, you stand together and you line up shoulder to shoulder, right? And you are not allowed to leave any gaps. Like that commandment to not leave any gaps is, I think, so profound, right? Because what does that tell someone next to you then if you leave that gap in your ritual worship, right? It sort of conveys that there's a reason that maybe you're off put by them. You don't want to be kind of next to them in solidarity with them, so to speak, in this prayer. And so I reflect on that a lot when I think about sort of being in a broader sense of community, in an American community, for example. What is that coalition like that doesn't leave any gaps, right? Even with somebody I might not like or simply don't know, right? To still feel like I have to stand right up against you. I have to be right up against you in this. And that's I think a lesson that I'm thinking about in terms of, what that might look like in action.
So the rest of you, anyone want to jump in on this? And I'm really eager to get to the question of how do we actually do that, Maggie, what you put so beautifully, and how do we do that as communities of faith and communities of conscience? Like it seems clear that it's not that the action models of the past are completely untenable, but it seems like we need to be finding new ways to come forward and not let there be that gap. And our faith traditions, in terms of moral imagination, give us a lot more breadth of understanding of what that looks like. So I'm just looking at our time and wondering if we might move from this question of the vision of us working together, moving us forward, to what that actually might look like in practice. And maybe Sharon, I'll turn to you to jump in on that one.
Thank you. And I find that image, by the way, Maggie, of the prayer posture as a larger metaphor for life so deeply moving. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to carry that with me. That's really very deeply moving to me. So I have, as we all have, spent a lot of time thinking, worrying, praying about this. And we also have to recognize that never before in history has there been an attempt to do what we're trying to do here in the United States, which is to create a multicultural, multiracial democracy. It's never existed before in history. And that, first of all, acknowledging that this is an experiment. And I think a lot of us had kind of assumed it was a success and that there were hiccups, and now we're being challenged by forces of history that really want to get to the bottom of that and undermine the very pinnings that we. So I assume those of us on this call, that we assume to be structurally sound. Clearly, they're not, and it's going to take a lot more work. And that's one of the reasons that I, with so many others, including Reverend Davie, and now in partnership with Union Theological Seminary, started this project called The Beacon, because I realized what we need is very small actions that are ritualized, that can happen on a regular basis to remind us all that it is possible to do something. And I believe deeply that once you do something, you develop those muscles to be able to do more. And really the something at this moment is, how do we help our people, our universe survive? I mean, we're at a very existential level here where people want to just pull up the stakes, go inside their houses or their apartments, turn off the TV and just try and see, can they survive? And obviously for some people, ICE is beating down the door, and that's not an option that's going to work. For other people, they're hoping that somehow those forces aren't going to come. And we know what history has to say about that. So we're in a sweet spot, I believe, right now, this moment in this rising authoritarianism. And the idea is, how do we help people do a structured week? So at Beacon, we do 30 minutes a week. It sounds like it's very small, but like exercise, you have to start with something that builds up these spiritual muscles to do more. We chose Thursday, which is not the Sabbath for any of the traditions, so that it's not specifically interrupting religious practice, and welcoming everybody to do it in our own communities. How do we stand out with a sign 30 minutes a week, reminding ourselves of who we are, thinking of what we want to be on that sign, whether it's something like the sign behind me, compassion, not cruelty, and to do that for 30 minutes so that the others in the community see it. I think it's essential to come up with something in which we, as from multi-faith traditions, come together in this very limited time, but I think have an extreme spiritual impact, existentially, spiritually, cosmically. And it has an impact on those of us who hold the signs. It has an impact on people who see them. And then it has that ritual aspect of a regular weekly moment. And I'm finding that's what we have to encourage people to do, because the big steps, we don't really know what they are. We have the lawyers, we have the legal organizations that are filing the lawsuits, we have the public advocacy groups working on policy. But those of us who are in the faith universe and we talk about action, we come up against this. Well, what can we do that both strengthens our spiritual muscles, has an impact on the universe around, strengthens community? And Ruth Ben-Ghiat, the great historian of authoritarianism, says it's exactly this. There are three things that we can all be doing. We're not all the big lawyers or the policymakers, but the first is to be visible in public spaces, to not give over the public sphere to the fascists, to make sure there's visibility in the public spaces. Second is to make sure that we're doing it in community. That community can be a religious community, it could be our local neighborhood community, in connection with other people, to break down the isolation of people being alone. And the third is to remember to laugh and have some joy and not lose the love of life for which we're fighting to begin with. And to not feel like we cannot have a good time because the world is in fire. In fact, that's a part of fighting the fire itself.
Yeah. Wow, what three wonderful insights. Oh my goodness. I wrote those down. I'm going to think about them a lot and act on them. And I'm going to turn to you, Greg, because I know in the Buddhist community, there's a also similar deep reflection on what it means to put yourself, your community and your body in action, as witness. Maybe you could jump in here.
Well, I'm very excited that both Maggie and Sharon are talking about ritual, public ritual in this way, and it's very powerful and moving, and I think right on. Um, I think I'm bridging two questions here, the one about the vision and the one about the response. I'm reminded of the Aganya Sutta, which is this kind of in some ways a formation story of the human species in Buddhism, or the humans, and it starts out with a fall story, literally a fall from the sky story, where what starts the problem is early humans grasping after the material realm, greed. And then slowly society becomes one of war, and it goes through stages, and we end up kind of where we are. So I think there's something about identifying the lack of a democratic economic system that comes from that is a part of the vision of where we're going. So that's as a deep root for so many things that are going on. Another thing that is cause of the suffering is that the Buddha talks about regularly, is the grasping of views. And what happens with the separation when we grasp our own views. And it doesn't mean that we don't hold views. We obviously do. We can't not do that. But that's different from grasping them in such a way that other people are pushed outside of our hearts, essentially, because we grasp our views to that degree. And we see that everywhere now. So in thinking about that, it's a lot that we're looking to transform. And there is something about views now that is a fundamental issue, in that there's such a proliferation of so many. And we now live in a world where you don't really even have to evidence your views anymore. You don't have to verify them. You don't have to, it's assertion as truth. And that creates a world where even religious people coming out with views doesn't have the same power to have a view. So there's something really fundamental to me, something very key about public ritual. And I believe that I think this is an intuition. I don't know that I can prove any of what I'm about to say, but I believe that people are looking for um, uh, religious leaders showing up with the strength of their traditions in what we're willing to renounce, risk, and show with our bodies. Like, in some ways, that's our strength. That's the strength of the history of religious traditions, is that we show up with our bodies. We show up with our bodies on the line in a particular way. So you talk about the Buddhist tradition. It's interesting to me. I do this from time to time for different reasons, which is to have, the role of a public fast, or the role of 7 days of prayer, or whatever that is, where we're actually showing up in numbers of people that are doing this together across traditions. It it shows a different kind of commitment than I go on my Facebook page and state my view, which everyone's doing. And that's not to take away from the importance of putting out different views, but literally everyone is doing that now. And so what is it to do something that not everyone is doing? And that breaks through in some way, that shows a different kind of commitment to the inherent dignity of every person. And am I willing to put my own body on the line for the inherent dignity of every person? And so that's something that comes that I think about when I hear about ritual. There is something in ritual right now that it needs to be very public, very apparent, very committed, very broad reaching, and something that our country can't turn away from. They have to see us. And the private public division has collapsed. I mean, social media, everything, that's gone. So there's no reason for us not to be fully present with our practices everywhere. So except they will fight against it, but there will be people who fight against that, but that's okay. We can be in solidarity with each other. Um, and that will bring us, like Sharon said earlier, seeing all of you brings me strength as well and encouragement. So thank you.
Simran, you want to jump in here? This is a great conversation about public ritual and activism and how we show up in this moment.
Yeah, I did actually, and just to sort of build on something that I'm hearing from you, Greg, and thinking particularly in the imagination of what you were describing, Maggie, about what a community looks like in a Muslim context, in a worship context, and it's not actually that different from what I experience in a Sikh context, and what you both have me thinking about here. The question to me often comes back to what is distinctive about religion. What do our traditions teach us that we might be able to bring forward in this moment? And I've been thinking a lot recently about the lack of leadership, which I think a lot of us roll our eyes about what we're seeing in this country, but also about the lack of models. If we wanted to do something different, who could we emulate? Who is out there doing work that inspires us and feels like it's aligned with our values? And those models feel so few and far between. And when we look within our religious traditions, I think one of the things that I feel like is missing, and this is sort of getting at what you were describing, Greg, is sacrifice. I mean, so much of what we love and cherish and admire about the people in our traditions is their willingness to sacrifice. I mean, the significance of martyrdom is precisely that. And yet in our world today, it feels so hard to give up the tiniest things, right? It feels hard to give up 30 minutes to show up to an event because it costs too much for everything else we have designed our lives around. And so what would it look like for us to think about risk? Not just calculating what the risks are and calculating what the return on investment is, but just like what is the risk threshold I'm willing to take on to do the right thing because it's the right thing? I don't see us working in that way as a society, and that's discouraging, but it's also gives us a window into what is necessary, what has worked in the past in moments like this, and then what is incumbent on us to take on. So that's really just sort of sticking out to me as I'm listening to you all and Serene, your question of, well, what do we need to do? How do we show up in a way? I think as people in this world who are leaders and parts of communities where we have influence, what would it look like for us to start bringing in that conversation and also modeling what risk and sacrifice looks like so that people can start taking that on themselves as well?
And Simran, you just caused me to reflect on making visible the risk of not taking risk, because the risk right now is so incredibly high for everyone. It's an illusion that you can go to a space where there is no risk. It's sort of like, how do we be conscious, faith grounded about the risks we're taking in their direction? So Fred, I would love for you to jump in on this um, and talk about ritual resistance and faith and how we practice this in the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Serena. And just to build on a little bit of what everyone has said, but to point to this question of sort of how do we prepare ourselves? How do we get grounded to do the kinds of things that we're being called to do? And, I reflect back on my days at Yale Divinity School and my time in the classroom with Henry Nouwen. And Henry Nouwen taught me the importance of being grounded in my faith and making that a daily ritual. So I think what I would say to start is that if we really want to be able to do the work that's before us and do it well, we need to have that sort of spiritual grounding every day. We need to have a ritual where we have time for prayers, we have time for reflections on readings, and we have our own personal time for just silence before we begin to engage the things that confront us. I used to think about it in my personal life as getting all prayed up for the day. Getting in the best tradition of the sort of Black church folks that I grew up with, just getting myself prayed up and ready, and then accessing that kind of grounding, accessing that kind of daily reflection throughout the day, as I am confronted, or as we are confronted with the basic things we have to do in order to survive, but particularly as leaders who run and manage institutions and have responsibilities for people and want to create the kind of communities that we've all talked about here today. We have to ourselves be grounded and have access to the spiritual and the divine things that will allow us to do that. So that would just be one quick reflection on this. I think the other is that I agree with Sharon and others that have talked about the need for public witness. And it doesn't have to be that complicated, as Sharon has pointed out. The work that she's doing through Beacon is national work. Every Thursday night, 30 minutes. We have a group in New York that does multi-faith Mondays, where we meet 30 minutes on Monday, 5:30 to 6. Greg has spoken at this. Sharon has spoken several times. We're going to get others of you on this call and in the city and places to be there as well. But we meet for 30 minutes at Columbus Circle in Central Park. And it's a multi-faith effort to bear witness to our belief in democracy, and encouraging people of various faith traditions, passersby, to stay strong in that commitment and to do it in community and to do it in a very public way. So we get grounded in our faith and our private time, and then get out there and give expression to it in this public way. One of the things that I lamented during the Biden administration quite a bit was the failure on the part of the administration, which I supported, as many people here know, but the failure on the part of that administration really to call the faith communities together in times when we needed it most. And it would not have taken much. Now, this administration, at the risk of being slightly partisan, is not going to do that, but other faith leaders can. So why don't we have a quarterly multi-faith worship service, national worship service? Let's do it at the National Cathedral. It has that kind of resonance with people around the country. It has a tradition of doing that. Let's do that. And then let's model to the rest of the nation the kind of nation that we want. It doesn't have to be complicated things, personal, morning reflections, weekly 30-minute gatherings, quarterly national events where we all get together. And the final thing I would just say is that, and it sounds a bit trite, but let's all think about that we all can do something, sort of reaching deep in our traditions, being in community. We all can do something. And whether it's being on a Zoom like this together for an hour and a half, or those 30 minutes once a week, or something that requires more of us, joining Reverend Barber and others, at the Capitol, engaging civil disobedience. There is a place for everyone in this struggle for the kind of world that we want. And I would just encourage us all to find our way to do that. I want to say one final thing about community, and that is we had the option of doing this webinar a different way. And it would have been sort of easier for our tech people. And that would have been to have all of you who are gathered here just sign in and see the 6 of us and no one else. And I said, no, That's not building community. We need to be able to see each other and then eventually touch each other. And as Maggie says, stand shoulder to shoulder, kneel shoulder to show our fundamental and deep commitment to humanity, to each other, to community, and to our fellows in the struggle. So personal grounding, the community work that we do, and then finding a way for all of us to do something big or small in this effort of putting ourselves on the line to have the kind of world we want to have.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Fred. And you brought up the different way we decided to do this to bring everybody who has signed on into the conversation. And we're getting close to an hour, so I wonder if that's a good moment to segue into opening up the conversation more broadly. But before I do that and turn it over to Giselle and Emma to moderate the questions, I want to give any of the five of you a chance for something that was stirred in your mind as you were listening to the other panelists. Okay. If there's nothing jumping out, then let's move to the bigger public conversation. So
I think Sharon was about to say something.
Sharon,
Serene.
I'm sorry,
One thing I
Sharon,
want
go.
to say that I'm moved by what everybody said is that also I think our faith traditions give us a different metric for success than other places do. And I think that is a profound thing, that the metric for success isn't necessarily what we can change from today to tomorrow. There's a longer frame, and also we understand there might be some other ways that our traditions help us understand success, and that's very important in times of authoritarianism, I believe. Anyway, that's just the one thing I wanted to mention.
Mhm. And I think as everyone has gestured towards in deep religious traditions, there's also a different sense of time, which I think you're getting at in terms of your comments about history and looking at what we can learn from history, what we've seen happen time and again, what responses are, but also to have a longer framework for where we're going in terms of how we modulate and think about how we come forward. So thank you for that. And everyone, thank you for each of your comments. And Emma and Giselle, are you ready for the conversation?
Yes, we're ready. Thank you all so much for your wonderful contributions. We have a great selection of questions. So I'll just start with the first one. This is from, let me make sure I get the name. Kat and Goldali Katsanis Samel. And the question is, honest question, since the pivotal 2024 election, do each or all of you sense that your personal relationship with the divine, or whatever you term God, has been fractured, namely when it comes to trust? I ask because sometimes it's hard to be unified with others around us, perceived friend and enemy, when we feel distrusting of God. It's a tough place in which to find ourselves, and I think authoritarian leaders play on that lack of trust, which starts from within ourselves. And I'll put that in the chat as well if anybody wants to take that on.
Maggie, you look like you're raising your hand there.
Well, yeah, because I think I resonate with that so much, and it's something I have thought about as well, right? I think there's great spiritual turmoil, right? That political turmoil can generate for some of us. And what I've been trying to do for myself, and what I would encourage you to do as well, is to really have some grace for yourself, right? This is, I think, as someone said, kind of our first authoritarian takeover for many of us. It is a time of incredible transition for our country as we are wrestling with this. And when you think about kind of other major transitions that we have in our lives, we tend to, witness that we need to extend ourselves grace in that, right? Like a new home, a new marriage, a new baby, a new job even, right? Like the kinds of adjustments, the onboarding in the job that takes time, right? Um, the figuring out who your neighbor is in your new home that's going to have your spare keys. I think there's similarly in this moment of incredible transition in our nation's history, and hopefully it will not, be a permanent, irreversible transition. But in the current moment of transition, to extend ourselves that grace to figure out, okay, what are the spiritual practices that are going to sustain me during this time? I heard the quote once, it comes up so often for me, you never walk through the same river twice, right? This notion of if you're on a journey, right, and you were to cross back, even across the same river, like the water is different. It's right, it's gone. It's new water, new fish, right, that are coming through that river each time. And because I have this tendency myself to go, all right, spiritual crisis moment. Okay, what were the rituals I was doing at that moment when I was doing so great? Like, I'm gonna go do those again, right? What were the spiritual practices I was engaging in? I'll just go right back to that and everything will be fine. But it's a new river, right? This new moment in my life, this new moment in my nation's life, right? It's a new river. And so figuring out what works for me spiritually is going to have to be different. And I just have to extend myself a little bit of grace in figuring out what's going to get me across that river this time.
I wonder, Greg, if you might want to respond also from a tradition that doesn't have a notion of the divine in the ways in which the Abrahamic traditions do. How you would respond to that question of trust?
Yeah, thank you. The question resonates though for me deeply because I think in my tradition, one of the things that are really focused on is while you work for the world that you hope for, you never trust the world to be that because it's not, right? So to kind of trust that the world is going to be, that's trusting my projections onto the world, not what it is, which I actually don't know what it is. Whatever story I'm telling about the world is my story about the world. I don't know what the world is. And so when my trust in a particular projection is broken, then I have to kind of look again and say, what is this world I'm looking at and what's going on? So for me, spiritually, what I'm working with right now is what is it to have faith without an object? A particular thing, because there's not a monotheistic, I'm not in a monotheistic tradition. And so, but there is a deep sense of building a practice-based faith, regardless of that. And so when I am practicing for myself, it's like, how do I deepen my faith, and we might say trust, in a way that isn't attaching to a view? And I think that is, and then it becomes stable. As long as it's attached to a view, it's unstable. And so that's one of the things that and it's hard. It's very difficult to do. It's extremely difficult to do. And I fail constantly. But but I think that's one of the things that come up when I hear that question, because it is a hard time to trust the world. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, Greg. There's this line, one of the first lines in Sikh scripture, and one of the first lines that I learned, it's a question, and Guru Nanak asks, "Kiv sachiara hoye, kiv kure tutte pal." He's asking, how do I become truth? How do I break falsehood? And then his answer that follows immediately is one that I never really understood how it was an answer. He says, "Hukam rajai chalna nanak likhya naal," and that's learn to walk in the way of the world, accept the will, accept what happens in the world. And to me, that had nothing to do with truth. But I think what I've learned is, and in line with what you're just describing, that actually is the way the world works. That we delude ourselves when we think we have control over everything. I mean, let alone what's happening on the other side of the world, but like, will we breathe tomorrow? Like we don't know. That's not up to us. And so I found, there's a nice parallel, and I mean, it's now that I'm at a seminary, a lot of my exegesis comes from other traditions too. And the one that has really been helping me understand this concept is the serenity prayer, this question of, or this prayer of, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that has actually become a mantra that I'm returning to constantly. I mean, daily now, of, the overwhelm of the darkness and the chaos and the turbulence of our world, and feeling like there is no hope, and wanting to give up, and recognizing that actually I can't fix everything, but there are some things that I can engage in and have agency over, and finding that right balance. And so, yeah, there's something really interesting about this question of how the serenity prayer might actually help us be more truthful about our lives and how we understand the world.
Is there any? Go ahead,
yeah,
Fred.
I mean, I sort of, after my time of prayer and contemplation, I kind of cling a little bit to the psalmist and the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, Sharon, and the ones who would shake their fist at God and say, "What are you doing?" You know, just come on, God, let's, don't make a lie out of us. Where is this goodness and compassion and caring and deep love that you've spoken to us over the ages? Why am I not seeing it in a particular situation or, our current circumstance? Where is it? Where is it? And part of it's kind of the mystery of, belongs to the mystery of living a life of faith. I mean, you can't see or know everything. When Job asked that question, I think God said, "Where were you when I formed the world?" But it's sort of like, how dare you assume or presume that you can know what I'm up to and what I'm doing. But then when I asked that question, I also remember that that question was asked again, as I recall, in one of the camps during the Holocaust, sort of, where is God? And somebody whispered, "Well, he's right here." Or God is right here. God is in the person who is doing the acts of compassion and caring in the midst of the most horrific situations that humans have created. So I shake my fists. I ask the question. I accept some of the mystery and the fact that I can't know all the answers, but then I see the clues and the manifestations all around us, in almost every situation, many of the most horrific. But I and I hope this is okay. I just want to give myself space to be angry with God sometimes, and just to say, come on, get with it. There's a spiritual about that relates to Jesus being in the boat during the storm and the disciples fearing that they are going to drown. And in that spiritual, one of the lines is a command to Jesus. Get up, Jesus. We're depending on you. It's that kind of honest, if it's honest, I think it is, that kind of just kind of raw engagement with the Almighty, with the divine, that I find also as helpful to me as my quiet, more contemplative time. I rage at God at times and trust that that's a part of this journey and this walk as well.
Yes, Sharon,
I share
you
that
turn off
deeply
your.
with you, Fred, and I want to add to that reading of the biblical, the Jewish prophets, that they're so rooted in that sense of outrage. And they also understood that sometimes bad things were happening, and that the agents of the destruction of the Israelite or Jewish people were doing it not only without God's approval, but sometimes because of the behavior of the people themselves. So in our contemporary world, we would call it blaming the victim, which I really don't like, because what it's saying is that we have agency to change some of the behaviors which made it possible for evil to exist. So it's tradition in our tradition that the first temple was destroyed in 586 because of baseless hatred, that we were practicing baseless hatred, and so this terrible thing happened. And so a lot of the events that happen in the world are there to teach us to look inward to see, are there ways that we acted that made it possible for evil to have its way, so to speak. And that's a much bigger theological discussion, and I hesitate because it does have that echo in contemporary language. However, I find it very powerful. Have we not, what are the ways that we have not led and acted to create a world of God's compassion that made it possible for these evils to have fertile ground and emerge? And that we do have control over. It turns out that there are things we can do. There are ways. And that's one of the reasons that Gandhian nonviolence speaks so much to me, because it really teaches us over and over again that violence will never be the answer in response even to evil, because we have to get to the core of the violence, which includes behaviors and actions we might have taken, and act in a way that looks at our enemies not as enemies to be crushed, but as opponents to be convinced, to be persuaded, to be trained.
Ryan, oh, look at this. I'm just finishing up.
That wasn't me. Sorry about that. So this goes to what everybody's been saying, which are what are the things that we can do? You know, the saying that means so much to me: no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And to offer ourselves the grace that Maggie talked about, to figure out what is the something we can all be doing that transforms the very nature of the earth itself, so that the fertile ground for the evil to grow is diminished a little bit, and the ground for compassion and love, which sounds almost, old-fashioned or something in these days, but remains to be what we're, I think, as people of faith about. Resisting the violence, resisting the division, resisting the dehumanization. And it's a full-time job to say, I will not get sucked in to that kind of language. And it's hard work, but I think that for me, my faith tradition helps give me the tools to, all right, I don't accomplish it every day, let's be honest, right? Some days I'm just so angry, but then, okay, I have a place to reset and to come back and say, all right, we have to figure out what we can do, what muscles we can exercise. How do we create a world in which baseless hatred is not the coin of the realm? And by the way, I want to mention, something which is so big on all of our hearts right now, which is what we're seeing visible in Gaza, this terrible situation in Gaza, and want to be able to expend that sense of compassion both to Palestinians and to Israeli Jews, and to resist calls for anti-Arab or Islamophobic or anti-Semitism to solve it. We know that none of that will help solve it, and we see peoples who are so deeply traumatized by their own pasts that the only way they can function is with hate, in a response full of hate. And I really believe it's in our faith communities that we can help thread this needle through terrible times, so that there's a future, a really deeply meaningful future for all of us.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you everyone for your responses to that question. Wow. That's what happens when you put a bunch of theologians together. We go deep. Thank you. Giselle, is there a next question so we can get a few more in before our time runs out?
This
Emma, I
question
think, has
has come up in from a couple of people, so we've kind of combined them. Christian nationalism and other forms of religions have been used throughout history to oppress. What can we do to expose these traditions as anti-faith and complicit with fascism? How do we fight Christian nationalism and other sister members without losing the humane tenets of our tradition on a national and international stage?
Another easy question. that we can throw out there. So I think we should probably start with the Christians in the group. Fred, you can answer that question.
Of course I can. Oh, thank you, Serene. I think, I mean, for me, where I start with Christian nationalism is that it's not about Christianity at all. It's about ideology. And it is fundamentally rooted in an ideology that is that grows out of white supremacy in America, that grows out of the kind of jingoism, xenophobia, a very narrow sense of what it means to be an American and who can be an American. I mean, regardless of your politics, but if you look at what's happening with Zoran Mamdani right now and his race for mayor, it is outrageous, simply outrageous. Because for Christian nationalists and people who come from that ideology, Zoran can't be a legitimate American because he's not Christian and he's not white and he wasn't born here. But that is what we're up against. That is a real life present day example of the dangers of Christian nationalism. I want to just shout out the ways in which the Interfaith Alliance has been consistent in calling out Christian nationalism, challenging it in every way. Union alum, if I can point that out, Paul Rauschenbusch, who runs it and who had the foresight to have Maggie Siddiqi join him there, along with other people, including other union alums. You've done a great job at calling it out. But I think if we see Christian nationalism fundamentally as an ideology with very little to do with Christianity, then I think we have to respond to it as an ideology in the public square and call it out for what it is, without mincing words.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add that all religious traditions now are facing elements of our own traditions, which have gone to the extreme. It's not even, to call them right wing is not even, doesn't even, but extreme. We have inside of all of our traditions, these strains of extreme hatred towards others. That is something that we all have to struggle with.
Mm-hmm. I also just, I didn't mean just to throw this at Fred and Sharon. Thank you for jumping in and expanding the question. But I also struggle within myself, and Maggie, you were talking about this early on, that this present moment thrives on a politics of division and the creating ever deepening sense of division. And I think one of the biggest challenges as a Christian minister that I face is, how do I both name Christian white supremacist nationalism for what it is, while at the same time not reducing everyone in that community that I decide to put there, whether or not they put themselves there, to some caricature that stops the capacity for us to come together. And I think that's one of the hardest moments right now. I mean, I say this within the Christian tradition, is how do I both build bridges and call out really deep divisions? How do you hold those two together? Because I know that there are many who I might easily put in the category of Christian white supremacists, Christian nationalists, who add on some of these issues might deeply share many values with me. Or how do I find space to move towards them in a way that's transformative? So I think that's one of the challenges of embedded in that very good question.
I'm happy to jump in. I think part of it is, I try to avoid putting those labels on particular people, but rather on particular policies, right? On particular actions. I think that is incredibly helpful in the process. I think we also have a tendency toward, when we look at coalitions, of having a kind of all or nothing approach. Like, we must agree on every single issue in order for us to work together. I think we need to be a lot more fluid in terms of how we think about, signing on to the same letter doesn't mean we agree on everything else, right? That's very different from co-convening a massive campaign on something together, right? And then there are all kinds of different sorts of partnerships in between. I also have been talking a lot about Ted Lasso principles, our pop culture prophet, Ted Lasso. So one, be curious, not judgmental, right? So if among the people with whom you're finding common cause, you feel like someone is demonstrating what you see as some real cognitive dissonance about an issue, or seems to have kind of a values misalignment with you, trying to abstain from passing that immediate judgment, being curious about how could that be, right? Like, that's a spiritual exercise in and of itself, to have that empathy and humility, that might lead you to finding common ground. But even if you still end up disagreeing, it'll still help you honor their humanity and their convictions, right? Keeps you working together on the things you do agree on. And then the other Ted Lasso principle is all people are different people, right? So avoiding entering into conversations with preconceived notions about where someone stands, how they're going to act, just because of experiences that you've had with maybe someone else in their community, or who holds some other kind of affiliation that you find disagreeable. Those are all incredibly difficult things to do, but those are ones that I've certainly been keeping in mind there.
Yeah, that's great. I don't want to jump ahead if someone has somebody else to add to this.
I'll just, Simran, go ahead. I've spoken. You were going to jump in.
Well, just a quick note on what Maggie just shared about curiosity. I've been reflecting recently on Christian nationalism in particular, and especially teaching this course this last semester at Union on history and religion on Turtle Island, and thinking about colonization and the church, and how religion has been weaponized to harm people for centuries here, and that's continuing, and it's hard to see sometimes because we don't talk about it, and it's not part of our national narrative. And then it's also really hard to know what to do about it, because you don't want to paint people with a broad brush. You don't want to paint traditions as exclusively harmful, and I don't want to throw religion out with the bathwater, right? Like, so it's really complicated in a lot of ways, and then also it feels really simple at the same time. And the principles that you just laid out, Maggie, they're the kinds of things that I talk to my young daughters about, right? Like, all people are different. People don't judge a book by its cover. Be curious about people. If they do something that's bad, it's not that they're bad people. It's that they made a mistake, or their heart's in the wrong place or something, right? Like, so these principles feel so, and maybe that's true about a lot of our most profound convictions, as people of faith, that the real truths are also the easiest ones to intellectualize and the hardest one to put into practice, right? Like, this notion we started with in this conversation around seeing the dignity of all people, like, who disagrees with that? And also, how hard is it for even those of us who try and live by it every day? So anyway, I just really appreciate that note, and just want to name how hard it can be, as you're asking us to think about, Serene, how hard it can be to square that we don't want to reject people, and also we want to hold them accountable, and there's real harm that's happening. So anyway, back to you, Fred.
Oh, thanks. And I will be brief. So two thoughts. One is that Sharon, there are places where people who might fall in that nationalist camp, as in quote Christians, try to work with other folks. And Sharon and I found ourselves in one of those situations with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where there was a whole lot we couldn't agree on, but there was a lot we could agree on too. and we found ways to move forward with that. So I would say that, sort of calling out Christian nationalism for the ideology that it is, but then also looking for those places where you might connect with people who find themselves in that space. I like the idea, Maggie, of focusing on policies that are Christian nationalists, and not necessarily individuals, but there are individuals who call themselves Christian nationalists that we also might be able to make some common cause with. The other thing I would say is that, in thinking about this conversation today, I thought about, bridge buildings. How do we do bridge building? I think, Maggie, the principles you laid out are great, but I also added some activities that we can all look at. For example, doing something about people going hungry. That seemed the situation in the starving of people in Gaza has seemed to rally people across many ideological, religious, and political spectrums to do something about it. No, it's hard for even the most heartless to say that children should starve, and when faced with it, we find ways to join hands, arms, forces to do something about it, and to see the ways in which the various communities around the world who would otherwise be at each other and probably will be in other ways soon, have rallied to say, all right, let's do something about this, is really encouraging. Kind of nobody believes that people should be sick and have it go unaddressed. Again, if you just want to focus on children, that's a fundamental place where we can all come together and begin to say, how do we, as people who live in a multi-faith, pluralistic, diverse society, join hands to do something about that? Nobody wants to see kids uneducated. And the list goes on. So there are ways in which we can sort of lay out a hand of cooperation to people who might otherwise label themselves nationalists or Christian nationalists. That there are all these ways that we can build bridges. It still has to be called out, I think, for the narrow, destructive ideology that it is, but we can still find ways to be in community on those issues with which I think we can agree from time to time.
And an interesting footnote is that the person that the current administration put in charge of the American distribution centers in Gaza happens to be a Christian evangelical supremacist who Fred and I worked with on the USERF. So it's there's a lot of very interesting cross sections here, but the way it's done, that then becomes, and that's, I know, a whole other challenge of how do we do that. And I want to say this is not the first time we're facing this. When I first came to CBST, for instance, I did a lot of work with the Catholic Church here in New York City, because on economic justice issues, the Catholic Church in New York was way ahead of the Jewish community on really, really hardcore social justice issues. But believe me, they weren't great on gay issues, right? But it was more important for me to be working with them on feeding the poor and thinking about hunger issues in New York than whether or not they were okay with the fact that I was a lesbian rabbi. Part of the problem is that we have gotten to a point also where everybody wants purity with everybody they work with. And that's on our side, so to speak. That's in our people. Our people are the ones who often present with these purity tests that make it very difficult. And if you don't agree on 100%, you're going to get a lot of pushback in a way that even then I had to say, no, the Catholic Church and my local Catholic priests in the congregations, we're the leaders on economic justice. We have to be able to, and that ability to call our people out for saying, no, we won't work with X, Y, or Z because of X, Y, or Z. That's a place that I do think that we can exercise some leadership and challenge and think about. And I would sit at the table with people who didn't think I should be gay person, couldn't be a gay clergy person, and certainly shouldn't lead a gay synagogue. And yet, you know what? We did some really great work on economic justice, and that was really important for me.
And Sharon, thank you for getting us to that point in the conversation, which just opens up a whole realm of discussion about how even and especially progressive communities can be destroyed by their own desire for purity in a very messy world. From religions that at times have called for purity to their own demise, but also have deep wells of capacity for dealing with the messy nature of human existence. That's why these traditions exist, is to embrace and hold that messy conglomeration of who we are. So we're at the end of our time. Wow. I want to first thank each of our panelists for taking time on July 30th to be a part of this conversation. I want to thank you for your wisdom. As each of you have spoken and invoked activities that you're participating in, I want to thank you for your activism, for the depth of the insight that grounds that, and also just for your inspiration as individual faith leaders who give us courage and practical advice on what it means to be sustained in this moment. I have learned so much today. I want to say thank you for the questions. I want to say thank you to Emma and Giselle for the work that you did with the questions, but also pulling this together. And I want to say a big word of thank you to each of you who've joined us. I'm sorry we did not get to all the questions and have a chance for everyone to speak. But I hope that you can use this conversation in ways that are useful to you in your own communities. And I just want to let you know that this will be available online for you to share the conversation after we close out today. It will still be available, and we'll share with you instructions on how to get that. And then last but not least, Fred, yes.
I want to just do a shout out to our tech folks back
Yes.
at Union as well, who helped us with this today, as well as people in the communications office and the other offices around Union too. Just a big shout out for them, because it was no mean feat to get this to work technologically. So thank you all.
Yes. Yes, thank you. And may we move from this space with courage, clarity, and compassion, ready to lead, ready to rest when we need to, and at all times ready to resist and to rejoice. So peace be with you all. Thank you.
Yeah.